I think when you realize you're not going to be able to pay your rent in 3 months, there's a lot that you can like pull out of yourself. um, I would never have called myself like a disciplined individual. I think that there are just times in your life where you realize you don't have another choice but to do something, really taking it day by day and getting small wins. And I had an amazing manager who was so supportive of me. And she really saw, I think, what I was capable of. And she always helped me be my best, but didn't put too much pressure on me because she knew, I was a junior data scientist, and she told me my number one priority was to learn. And I knew that if I could do anything, I could learn. The kinds of cultures that come up in gaming communities can be so fun and so supportive and so positive. But the flip side is that you can have small groups of people who are so toxic and hateful. And, just like in any place of the internet, they hide behind their headsets or their keyboards. I try to be very vocal and visible as a woman in tech and vocal about my experiences in gaming. And I think that for each person, whether or not they decide to get into a field where they might be a minority is a very personal decision. And it's something that you have to listen to your heart and where you're at, because it's not always going to be easy. And not everyone has to kind of take up that banner and be a trailblazer. And that's okay. And there's no shame in not wanting to do that. The world will try to hold us all back at some point in our lives. And so the worst thing we can do is hold ourselves back, right? We always need to be our own advocates and bet on ourselves to succeed. Um, because sometimes the only person betting on you will be yourself.
Welcome to the Richmond Alake podcast. This week, I am speaking with Carly Taylor. Carly is a machine learning expert and data scientist that works on arguably one of the biggest gaming products of the decade. Carly also shares career advice and data science knowledge on LinkedIn, where she's amassed over 60,000 followers. The conversation I have with Carly touches on a non-traditional route into the machine learning industry, her experience within the industry, and also diversity in tech. I'm Richmond Alake, and one person at a time, I'm exploring the stories of the humans behind AI and data. I hope you enjoy this conversation and come away a better practitioner. Thank you for listening. Hi, Carly. Thanks for joining me today. I'm very excited to be speaking to you. And when I was looking into your background, a realization I had when exploring your background was that you're a major component within a larger system that delivers one of the best gaming experiences known to man. You are responsible for some of the infrastructure security that Call of Duty, the game, runs on. So this conversation we're going to have today, my aim is to unpack your journey from a chemistry student to a data scientist, to a machine learning engineer, and now a senior manager. You're managing a team of data scientists. But first, could you please introduce yourself to the listeners?
Oh, Richmond, you are too kind. That was quite the introduction. I love that. Hey, yeah, my name is Carly. I do work on Call of Duty. I've been a gamer my entire life. And so this job has been a dream come true. But my journey to kind of break in has been a little bit non-traditional. So I'd love to go into that with you, Richmond, and we can talk more about kind of my path and all the twists and turns it took.
Good. Normally we'll start with the education. So could you provide some insight into your higher educational background?
Absolutely. So it kind of almost goes back to high school when the only class that I liked was chemistry. And that was kind of funny because all of my friends hated chemistry with a passion. But I really enjoyed it. And so I decided that that was going to be my major in college, because when you're 18, that's all you have to choose from is kind of what you've been exposed to. And so I got my undergrad in chemistry and I started working as an analytical chemist, testing medical devices. And it was amazing, but it wasn't the career that I wanted it to be. And at the time, I thought that, there were just chemistry jobs growing on trees, which didn't end up being the truth. And so I was thinking, I was working in this lab and I had decided if I want to stay in chemistry, I need to go to grad school. And if I want to break out of chemistry, I also need to go back to school because no one knows what to do with a chemist in any other industry. They just think we're kind of lost when we apply to jobs. So I decided to go back to grad school. And at that time, data science was really taking off. And I had a lot of friends who were in physics who had been poached by financial firms to go work on building algorithms for trading. And so I was like, well, I'm not a physicist, but I'm a chemist, and maybe I can do something with computation and computers and learn more programming and kind of get myself in that route while also sticking to what I knew at the time, which was chemistry. And so a little bit of new stuff with the programming, but a little bit of what I already knew with kind of the chemistry. So I tried to marry those two things together. And that's how I ended up studying computational quantum dynamics, which was
Wow.
super fun.
So your approach to what you studied in grad school was you had a strategy, right? You sort of
It
put it
did.
together, mixed chemistry with computing. But what is computational quantum dynamics? That is a mouthful.
It is. It's a lot. It's interesting. There are a lot of theoretical fields. If you think of the hard science like physics and chemistry and biology, now that there has been, such an explosion in computing power and supercomputers are made widely available even to researchers at universities. Um, there's been an explosion in the field of computational modeling. So even if I'm not going to sit at the bench and synthesize a chemical and see its properties, maybe it has medicinal properties, instead of doing all of that work and doing all of that research to build, like to synthesize something that's real, we can synthesize something on the computer and learn about its properties in a simulated environment. And so that's where the computational chemistry came in was what can we learn about different molecules and the way they might behave in systems on a computer so that later we can pass that information to our colleagues in the lab and they can synthesize the compounds that we study. And that workflow has really like accelerated drug development and all sorts of medicinal development because you can go through all of the different iterations of something that seems promising, find out that it's not going to work for whatever reason, and then land on a compound that's really going to be like exactly what you want. And so it's a huge field, powers a lot of like vaccine development and drug development that no one really knows about that's like going on behind the scenes at all of these big drug companies.
Yeah, I can imagine after sort of COVID, that role probably had like a boom and people were looking for more people with computational chemist quantum dynamics background.
Yes. As soon as I get out of the field, there's an explosion in the jobs in the field.
Are you ever gonna sort of like go back, maybe?
That's an interesting question. One of the things I studied in grad school was stability of RNA, which if you know about the COVID vaccine, it's an mRNA vaccine. And one of the issues with it, why it had to be kept so cold and the storage concerns is that RNA is very unstable. And one of the things we were looking at is what kind of things can you add to an RNA strand? How does it affect its stability? And so I think that if I were to go back, I'd probably be pretty far out from the state of the art.
Mm.
But I have found actually my first data science job, interestingly enough, I was able to use my chemistry knowledge. So it is interesting when you have a non-traditional background. Sometimes you'll find application for things that you know that you're not expecting. So I don't think you have to really go back into that field in particular to use those skills. You just have to find, the right kind of place, the right kind of startup, doing the right kinds of questions that you might use your expertise. At least that was my experience.
Yeah, and I was gonna ask about if there were any correlation or crossover between the skills to pick up studying computational quantum dynamics that applies within data science. Were you working with programming languages when with the simulators?
Yes. So, well, a little bit of yes and a little bit of no. Our main programming language was Fortran. So I wouldn't say that there's a lot of overlap with modern data science right now. But we also use Python and we use R for visualizations for a lot of the data EDA kind of after we ran an experiment. Because unlike when you're working in a lab, the output of your experiment is, some sort of solution or chemical. When you're doing computational chemistry, the output of your experiment is a ton of data. And so you really are just kind of limited by what you can use to analyze the data. And as a baby chemist in undergrad, my main tool was Excel. And I still love Excel for certain applications today. But with the volume of data we were generating, that quickly fell
Yeah.
apart. You couldn't put it into an Excel spreadsheet. So that's where the Python and the R came in. And that's where my love of big data and realizing that I didn't have to be intimidated by something that wouldn't fit into an Excel spreadsheet, that it was still manageable.
This is all sort of new ground to me, and I wouldn't have been aware of the correlation chemistry can have with computing and data science. Back when I was in college, I was more of the mischievous person in the chemistry class and distracting everyone. And we just did simple experiments and mixed chemicals together, but no one spoke about the application of computing sort of principles and programming language for actually synthesizing experiments. Because what you're doing here is you're working with synthetic data sets, right? It's
Mhm.
very, I feel like I would have been more interested if this was communicated earlier, or perhaps maybe the field had not developed back then. Um,
Yeah, I think that it's fairly new. It all of these computational research fields came on the heels of the explosion in computing power.
mhm.
And that didn't really become widely available to researchers until the national labs started building their supercomputers, at least in the United States. And so, you'd have maybe a small computer where you could do a little bit of like research, but the amount of power required to track an electron through time in even one molecule is astronomical. And the amount of data you're generating was completely unreachable and untenable for so long. And so it's been really very recent that this was even you were even able to handle or do the kind of research that people are doing now. So it's amazing, but it's new.
I'm going to ask a question, and you've already touched on it a little bit, but how did you get educated on machine learning and data science topics, like properly?
Yeah. So I had heard about data science. Like I said, I had friends who were, doing something that they called machine learning. And I was like, sounds kind of familiar to what we do a little bit. Um, but I had a really good friend at one of my first non-chemistry jobs. I was working my first tech job. It was the hardest one to get. Um, and he left to go do a data science boot camp because he was like, you know what I really would love to do with all this data we have is to make predictions. I was like, a thing? Can we do that? And he completed his boot camp and told me about it. And he was like, you got to do this. Like, this field is crazy. People are hiring, machine learning is taking off. And I do what I always do, and I was like, "I don't know, I don't know." I don't wanna have to quit my job because it's kind of an intensive 3-month thing, and, at the time, it wasn't after work, I had to quit my job and do it. And so I put it off for about a year, and then one day I was just like, "You know what? I'm gonna do it this summer. I'm just gonna go for it." And it was the best decision I ever made. 3-month boot camp, it was really hard, but I was able to use some of the things I learned in grad school about, linear algebra and statistics. And it was easier for me than I had imagined it would be because I talked myself into thinking that only geniuses who went to MIT were able to do this kind of work. And I really psyched myself out ahead of time. And I'm glad that I didn't listen to that voice that told me that I shouldn't do it or that I wasn't smart enough uh, because I really would have held myself back.
As in, one thing I've been researching is boot camps, right? And you sound like you did a immersive 3-month data science boot camp. And there's a bit of a sort of like a stigma around that, which is
Mhm.
the job prospects after you finish the boot camps. You're coming out going against people with masters and PhDs in relevant machine learning
Yes.
topics. Did you experience any sort of difficulty when you came out of your boot camp?
So I didn't as much as some people are now. And I think that's because when I finished my boot camp would have been right around when kind of the first cohorts of people who were getting master's degrees and PhDs in data science and machine learning were graduating. Because so many of those programs were new. And to get a PhD in the field, it'll take 6 or 7 years. So by the time those were starting, I don't think I had so much overlap with the competition there. And one thing that really helped me that I saw compared to other students in my boot camp was that I already had a master's degree. And so I think the fewer years of traditional schooling you have stacks against you as well, which, may or may not be the right move for employers, but that's just kind of the way that it is, unfortunately. So I think it was a little easier for me, but I'm not going to say it was super easy because I did go through a lot of interviews.
What's the most unexpected experience you had during the boot camp?
During the boot camp, I think, um, seeing a bunch of statistics that I hadn't seen since high school and thinking the math would be the easiest part for me because I had to take so much math in, undergrad and grad school, and then realizing like, "Oh, no, statistics is the hardest math I've ever taken, harder than differential equations, like, why is this?" Um, and I think I just realized, like, my brain sometimes does not like some of the stats outcomes that are, non-intuitive or, um, yeah, I
Uh,
don't know why.
I'm
I
totally
struggle.
the same. As in, I struggle with statistics and me picking up machine learning and studying machine learning. I started at deep learning side of things, so we
Okay.
stuff omit out.
Oh, wow, you just jumped right in the deep end.
But that was easier than statistics. As in, I avoided statistics back in high school, but now
Yeah, I could see that.
I'm refreshing my brain, just learning about probabilities, random forest
Mhm.
decision trees. But no, learning machine learning, I just went straight into deep learning, convolutional neural networks, and all of the computer vision solutions. Statistics did scare me. I liked
Uh-huh.
mechanics was more friendly, felt more friendly,
Yeah.
made more sense. Um, I want to ask a question. Why didn't you consider going back to university to gain that data science and machine learning masters? Why didn't you consider that?
I did. Um, the the question would have been, do I wanna have 2 master's degrees and potentially put off getting this job for another 2 years? Or can I take the gamble that a boot camp will be enough, and then I can show some of my other skills and upskill in areas that maybe the boot camp didn't touch on? And so I took that gamble. I think if I were to do it again, I maybe would have looked harder into doing a PhD program. The problem when I was even looking to go back to do my master's in computational chemistry is I was thinking about doing computer science at that point in time. Um, but what I realized was that based on my undergrad, because I had to do so many chem labs, like, I was doing all these weird classes, like group theory and like the stuff that wasn't super transferable, that if I were to do a master's or a PhD in computer science, I would have had to take so many undergrad classes. I might as well have gotten a second bachelor's degree. And I just was not about to spend the amount of time it would have taken to go do all of the prereqs just to get in. And so it was really one of those things that I was like, I'm not super young anymore. By the time I decided to do the boot camp, I think I was like 27 or 28. And I was just like, do I want to do another 8 years, and kick off my career in my mid 30s? Uh, Not to say there's anything wrong with that, because I know tons of people at every age changing careers. But for me, that just felt like it was going to take too long.
What was the general sort of um, career types people had during this boot camp? Like, was there like a typical persona and career that people had?
I would say that was not typical. One of my really good friends was a professional squash player, like had an
That's random.
undergraduate degree in electrical engineering, but like hadn't been in a classroom in probably 20 years. He had just been playing like tennis and squash. Another person was actually had a PhD in chemistry. And so we talked a lot. We're still friends. And he was a professor at one of the universities around here before he decided to do a boot camp. Um, Another friend actually didn't go to college at all, took a couple classes and dropped out because he realized it wasn't really for him and wanted to try boot camp instead as kind of an alternative. So it was really all over the map. Oh, one of my friends was a patent attorney, which was actually super helpful later when I was looking into like patenting some of my work that I could reach out to him about IP. Um, yeah, so it was like kind of from all over. It was a little bit wild to see the different backgrounds of people.
It's really awesome that you have patents that are machine learning related, and we will get into that in soon actually. But after the boot camp, what was your first role within the data science industry, and how was it? How easy was it to get that role?
It was pretty tough, I will say. The first day of the boot camp was the first day I sent out my a job application for a data science because I knew that I didn't have the savings to sit around and job hunt once the boot camp was over. The boot camp kind of wiped out all my savings. And so I was like, I really need to have a job as soon as I graduate. And so I was applying to jobs very early, meaning that when I was getting these phone screens and I was getting interviews, I was getting asked questions about data science topics that I hadn't covered yet. So I was really having to try to like flip ahead in our materials and like bring a bunch of stuff together. There was a lot of like hand waving and like fudging of answers going on. And so, it was a lot at the time, but I'm really glad I did it that way because that was my full-time job was like doing the boot camp and applying to jobs and like making sure that I was going to be set up so that I could have a role after I graduated. Um, so it was tough, but I'm glad I did it that way. Although there were a lot of nights where I was up late studying for a phone screen with the
Yeah.
hiring manager and yeah, it was a time.
I've never actually heard that before. By that, what I mean, I've never heard learners actually applying for roles as soon as they start a program. And that obviously you did a 3 month immersive course, which is very difficult. But now you're also adding the extra layer of difficulty of trying to apply for a job, which by itself is a full time job.
Mhm.
Um, how did you get that sort of work ethic, discipline, and motivation to sort of go that extra mile?
I think when you realize you're not gonna be able to pay your rent in 3 months, there's a lot that you can, like, pull out of yourself. Um, I would never have called myself, like, a disciplined individual. I think that there are just times in your life where you realize you don't have another choice but to do something, and you have something that you really, really, really want, and you're gonna work to get that thing that you want. And, that doesn't happen all the time. There are times now that I struggle with discipline. Sometimes you're just not in the mood to do whatever. And I think that's okay too. You don't always have to be pushing yourself. I think that sets people up to struggle with their mental health and put themselves in situations where they feel bad about not always succeeding. But when you do have those moments where you're very close to getting something you want and you feel like nothing is going to get in your way, like really grab onto those times in your life because I think you can do amazing things, even if you don't always, have that kind of rigorous discipline and stay up all night kind of attitude.
Just a strong conviction could push you and make you do more things
Hmm.
than you thought you couldn't. Okay. That is very interesting. And you mentioned that your first role was also within sort of like a research lab. Am
Hmm.
I correct? And I'm assuming that helped your background in chemistry also helped you get that role that was data science, but in a research lab.
Yes, it was extremely serendipitous that I found a, a role at a company that was doing R&D. So they were looking for people with research backgrounds, um, but they were doing data science R&D, and the applications had a lot to do with chemistry and physics. And so it was really, really a perfect fit almost for me. And that doesn't always happen. And so I just got very lucky, kind of right place, right time um, for that role, and it was amazing. I learned so much, but it was so scary.
Why was it scary?
You're just, your first data science role after maybe after just a boot camp, but I imagine maybe people with master's degrees probably feel the same way. You just, all the things that you struggle with. And so you remember like, oh, I still didn't really fully understand gradient boosting. Are they going to think I'm stupid on day one when someone asks me about it and I don't know? And you really can psych yourself up and think like, these are all the things I'm not good at yet. Like, do I deserve this job? Am I going to be able to do the day to day work? And I couldn't sleep the night before my first day because I was like, oh my gosh, they're going to find out that I'm just like a fraud. I did 3 months of like training. Why do I deserve this? And so there was a lot of that kind of,
Wow, you got the imposter syndrome hard.
oh, I've got it so bad. Still today, it's a constant for me.
Wow. So what made you then gain confidence in yourself in your first role?
Really taking it day by day and getting small wins. And I had an amazing manager who was so supportive of me. And she really saw, I think, what I was capable of. And, she always helped me be my best, but didn't put too much pressure on me because she knew, I was a junior data scientist, and she told me my number one priority was to learn And I knew that if I could do anything, I could learn. I've always been excited about learning and love learning. And I was like, I might mess up something or break something in production, probably, but at least I can learn from it. And that was kind of how I got over it.
Sounds like a very helpful manager. Could you speak about the size of the company you're working in? Was it like a startup, medium size, or large?
It was a startup. Yeah.
Okay.
There were, I think, about 40 people.
That is that is rare to have the opportunity to learn within a startup because I worked in a startup during my first time out of a master's. And let's just say there was no time to learn. It was more like, okay, this is what we want. And this is when
Trial
we
by fire.
exactly. And I love that, right? You're either gonna sink or you're gonna swim. And
Hmm.
most often than not, you are gonna swim because you just have to, like you said, you just have to learn the concept and apply it. And there's not really rocket science. But do you feel the same way? What's your opinion on that?
So, yeah, I think it's funny because startups, my experience prior to this, I had only worked in really kind of startup-y environments, but not as a data scientist, doing more analytics. And it was just like that. You're doing five people's jobs, everything is always on fire. It's kind of wild, wild west. But, this startup, it was so interesting because I think there were areas of business that were like that. Certainly like our sales teams, they were always hustling. Like they had to make us money, right? Like they were just always on it, like go, go, go. Our R&D team was just very unique in that the team that my manager had built, we had the depth to even hire a junior data scientist. A lot of companies don't have the time to hire because they have to train you, you know? Uh, but I was working, my mentor he had a PhD in algorithms and combinatorics from Carnegie Mellon. And he's amazing, like a literal genius and loves teaching. And he taught me so much. And so I think for him, there was a lot of that as well, like the hustling, the getting things done, the getting things built for the business. But I was shielded from that. And so I was just in a very lucky position that doesn't really exist in most companies.
And you mentioned mentorship, and you sound like you've had a lot of supportive guidance very earlier on in your career. I also saw that you've organized internship programs at the University of Colorado for high school students. Could you speak on into like the benefits of this internship, especially for AI roles?
Yeah. So I have been so lucky to have so many amazing mentors throughout my life, not just in data science, but most recently, like my first role in data science set me up for success. Um, and that's teaching has always been something I've been passionate about. So for me to flip the script as an adult and become the learner again and be a junior data scientist was hard, but it was also amazing because I realized what good mentors look like, what good mentors are capable of, what good managers look like, right? And that really set the archetype for me for what I wanted to grow into in my career as well. So I had taught in grad school, I had interns from our high school programs in grad school. Um, but I think where I really like came into my own was like being in that kind of position again as an adult, and then realizing like, okay, here's how I would want to be supported. Here's how I want to support, younger data scientists in the future and people who come to me for mentorship and for career advice and for help. And so I've always tried to take that kind of like patient empathy that was shown to me and bring that forward in my career.
Okay. Um, so we've spoken about how you got educated in machine learning, data science, and we've spoken about your first career and entry into data science. Let's fast forward to today. You're manager of a data science and engineering team. What does your day to day look like?
Zoom. I'll Zoom
Okay.
meetings all the time. Um, actually, the truth is that every day is different. Some days I am spinning up a test server in Warzone and I'm playing in a private match with people to try to test things that we've built. Days I'm in Zoom meetings all day. Some days I have some time to myself and I can actually write some code because there's some models that I maintain. So, I can check in on those and like dive into data a little bit. And some days are more long-term planning sessions where I'm thinking about like what I want our roadmap to look like, what kinds of problems might be coming up on our slate. And I can kind of have some quiet time to reflect on, what I can do for my team to set them up for success. But then there's also a lot of Zoom.
Yeah, Zoom is sort of taking over everything and remote working. One thing is you were part of the machine learning team that worked on Call of Duty. More specifically, you worked on behavioral modeling and data engineering. Could you elaborate on what behavioral modeling is and how machine learning lends itself to that particular task?
Oh, absolutely. So it's really interesting because there are so many, I think, burgeoning fields in machine learning, and behavioral modeling is one of those fields. It's really interesting to me. Um, we have obviously so much data right now, just companies in general in the world, right? But a lot of what we still don't understand is what drives people to make certain decisions. And, this kind of touches a little bit on reinforcement learning as well, which is what does it mean to be a human decision maker in a system, and like how does that look? Like if we were to build some sort of AI that were to look like a person, what behaviors do they have? I think it brings up what would it mean to pass the Turing test for a bot for something, to be more human like. And what this comes down to is, humans aren't always rational decision makers, despite what economists and market makers will tell you. Not everyone makes the same decision given the same set of inputs, right? And it's a very interesting space because sometimes you can find archetypes of decision makers, what people are going to do in certain situations. In a game like Call of Duty, right? It gives us there's a lot of data on what would you do when you're confronted with an enemy right here versus what would you do if you have an infinite amount of money versus, there's a lot of very interesting non-real world scenarios that can play out in a game. But there's also a lot of interesting real world applications for trying to figure out why people do what they do.
Mm.
Um, and so that's really what I'm interested in.
When you figure out why people within COD are doing what they're doing, what do you then do with that intelligence? What do you do with the information?
Well, from a security standpoint, we do a lot that I probably can't talk too in detail about.
That's fine.
But when you can understand why when you can understand what a normal person would do in a situation, and I say normal not to mean, like normal, but just kind of like if we're looking at the population as like Gaussian distribution, what does everyone kind of in the middle do? You can start to learn a lot about the tail ends of decision makers and behaviors. And when you're talking about something like security and you're talking about anomaly detection, you're interested in those tails, right? You're interested in what happens in the 99th percentile of performance and behavior. And if you can hone in on that and you can find those outliers, you can learn a lot about what people will do if maybe they have a little bit too much information about the system that
Mm.
normal decision makers don't.
Okay. And then I was going to dive into the complexities. More specifically, what are the not so obvious technical complexity that comes with developing machine learning models and the data infrastructure for a product that is utilized by millions of people in real time?
Yeah. I mean, so it's really fun, right? There's always a new technical challenge, especially if you're going to be doing any real time machine learning. Um, we do have hundreds of millions of players all around the world. Um, the interesting things are that your data isn't always as generalizable as you would like to think. And that is coming from a research background where I was looking at all of my research was in North America. And we were very actually focused on like Colorado in particular at my last role. And now with Call of Duty being a global product, the way that someone plays in the UK versus the US might be different. Now throw in the fact that we have completely different markets all over the world. In a market like Japan, people like to play games in internet cafes. The same thing with South Korea. So, what kind of data would we expect to get from an at home consumer on a PlayStation 5 versus what kind of data do we expect to get from someone who's playing on a public PC? And like those kinds of questions are very interesting, but you find these localized markets that have very different behavior. Um, and that's just kind of like the name of the game when you start looking at things at a macro scale.
It sounds like a lot to sort of take in and then drive the business decision and then create some business value. But thanks for sharing a lot of information because I know you can't really dive into too much about what you do specifically. So I guess we can move the focus to you. Well, we've been talking about you already, but more specifically, you work in a field that's male dominated. And furthermore, you work on a product where the customer demographic is also male dominated. I would like to explore the conversation of gender diversity in the tech industry and its importance. So, firstly, have you had any unfavorable experience within the tech industry working as a female?
Yeah, I have, unfortunately. And a bunch of my friends have as well. We have a group chat that's almost kind of a support group with a bunch of women who are in tech. And that's where we will message each other and say, I was talked over in a meeting today, or my opinion was disregarded until a man parroted it. And so it still happens. I would say that every year that I'm in tech, and certainly every year that I'm in gaming, it's changing. Um, and it's changing for the better. And I find that, I feel like it's changing rapidly for the better, which is good because it needed to happen. Um, and yeah, it's not perfect, but it's not what it was even when I started my career. So
Okay.
that's good.
Would you say the changes are happening quick enough to sort of entice young talent into the industry in the field?
That's hard to say. Um, I hope so.
Yeah.
All I can do is, from my perspective, I try to be very vocal and visible as a woman in tech and vocal about my experiences in gaming. And I think that for each person, whether or not they decide to get into a field where they might be a minority is a very personal decision. And it's something that you have to listen to your heart and where you're at, because it's not always going to be easy. And not everyone has to kind of take up that banner and be a trailblazer. And that's okay. And there's no shame in not wanting to do that. But the more people that we have that come in and are like, you know what, yes, we're going to band together. We're going to, make these changes. We're going to be the change we want to see, the more quickly that it's happening. Uh, but the industry still has a ways to go to be safe for women, to be safe for minorities, um, even not just the game makers, but people who play games. The kinds of cultures that come up in gaming communities can be so fun and so supportive and so positive. But the flip side is that you can have small groups of people who are so toxic and hateful. And, just like in any place of the internet, they hide behind their headsets or their keyboards. Um, and the more that we allow that kind of environment to thrive, the the fewer women who are going to play games, the fewer women who are going to want to work on games. And so we really need to kind of like take a holistic view, I think, for like the culture of gaming in general and what we want that to look like if we want it to be inclusive.
And on that note, what advice would you give to a young female looking to break into AI and tech and also be successful? That's the key thing, right? Get into this managerial position where you're leading a team that might be predominantly male. What advice would you give a young female looking to get to that level?
If I were to be able to talk to myself back when I was breaking in, uh, one thing I would say is to stop doubting myself so much. Just because the people that we see succeeding and who are the most prominent happen to probably be men doesn't mean that you don't have a space and that you can't fit in somewhere. And when the little voice in your head tells you, like, don't apply to that, you're not good enough, you don't have the skills, or, don't take that boot camp because you don't belong there, don't take that class, it's, you're not going to succeed. Don't listen to that little voice. In fact, follow it, because when you're challenging yourself and when you're like at the edge of what you think you're capable of is when that little imposter voice gets the loudest, and you should always follow it. Um, because when you start to get complacent and when you start to let it win is when you hold yourself back. And the world will try to hold us all back at some point in our lives. And so the worst thing we can do is hold ourselves back, right? We always need to be our own advocates and bet on ourselves to succeed. Um, because sometimes the only person betting on you will be yourself. And so you need to have that.
When you were just speaking there, I remembered one of the reasons why I got interested or more interested in programming, which was back in university in my bachelor's. I took games programming because the professor was a lady that worked on Tomb Raider. She worked on the
Oh,
Tomb
that's so
Raider
cool.
games. And I was like, dude, Tomb Raider is awesome. I used to have a book of Tomb Raider. I used to watch Tomb Raider. And I was like, and that was the one reason why I took games programming. And it was an awesome class and she made it very fun. And I explored Unity as well and Unreal Engine. But she did mark me down for some of my coursework because I didn't show up to classes. But she did mark me down for that. I would never forget that. Hopefully she's not watching this. But yeah, it was very inspirational and that really if I didn't go into AI or into web development, I think I would have gone into games programming because it was very cool and she made it fun. She made it really fun. She made us play against each other and it was refreshing. She was probably one of the only female lecturers I had during my course. In my course was in software engineering, and she was very inspirational.
That's amazing.
Let's talk about your visibility within the industry, but more specifically, you hold two machine learning patents. Could you provide some information into the nature of these patents that you hold?
So I have one non-provisional patent, which means that it has been published at the patent office, and I have one provisional patent that is pending becoming non-provisional. So both of these were at my first role, actually, as a junior data scientist, which is crazy
Yeah.
that I was able to materially contribute to the invention. Um, but part of our mission as on the R&D team was to get patents and to be more visible. And so the fact that the business really supported that and wanted that was what allowed me to pursue that, which, I don't think everyone always has that opportunity. So that was another thing that, they were focused on learning and visibility from like trying to be machine learning experts in the industry. Uh, but yeah, both of them, oh man, it's been a while since I've looked at them. I won't talk to them to the provisional patent, but the non-provisional patent is for it relates to fracking and how you can use machine learning to help with oil exploration and fracking an oil well. And so, yeah, it's a really interesting kind of like niche mashup of machine learning and energy and kind of what can you do to you like how can you use machine learning to be more safe, to be more efficient, and to help drive decisions on the oil field. Uh, to help the humans, the petroleum engineers make their best decisions while they're out on the field.
What was the difficulty in getting this patent accepted?
Um, so probably the hardest part were the many, 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 many conversations we had with the patent attorney. Um, their job is to really investigate the state of the art to make sure that the proposed art doesn't overlap with anything that's already in existence and to make the company and the IP is general enough that people can't really infringe on it. But the patent office wants it to be very specific. So it's this constant back and forth of like, how do you get generalizability, but also specificity in that like
Yeah.
you couldn't patent an invention that was like, I had an idea for a water cup, because it's like very general, like nothing that's never going to fly. But you don't want to make it like put yourself in a corner where like you give away exactly how you built your system, right? Because it's still IP. Um, and you don't want it to be so specific that someone can change one thing and work around it and then use it and make money off of your invention. So it was a lot of back and forth. Uh, our patent attorney was amazing. And most patent attorneys have technical backgrounds with, which is why they get paid so much money too, because they have the legal side and the technical side.
Okay.
But he still wasn't an expert in machine learning, which like he can't be an expert in everything. I think he also helped patent like exercise equipment, so like he's doing a bunch of different kinds of things. So there was a lot of like, how do you explain it like I'm 5? Now explain it like I'm 10. Now explain it like I'm an expert, and trying to find the balance of that language and make sure that they really understood kind of what you were doing so that they could write the patent in a way that was like true to the nature of the invention. So it's a very long iterative process. But high five your local patent attorney because they're doing lots of interesting things.
The two things I want to dive into. So the first one is patents, and going for patents so early in your career is not one that is usually, it's not a strategy that is usually spoken about. In fact, this is the first time I'm hearing about it. If you were to say, oh, someone that's got a patent in machine learning, I would be thinking, okay, you've been working in this field for decades. You're a pioneer within the field. Not saying you're not good, but I would have expected someone along the lines of Jan LeCun, Ian Goodfellow, and those folks. But it is actually sort of a sort of like an area within the field that anyone can explore. And I've been having conversations with other practitioners on how they can improve their visibility within the field, right? So you could write articles, you could do videos, but patents, it's probably, this is the first time I'm hearing about it. I want to ask, what were the benefits you had? That's what career benefits have you had from actually having this patent?
I think what you just said, people think that it's impressive and that it's cool. I put it on my resume because it's definitely like one of the things when you're hiring, you want to know that the person you're hiring can like walk the walk, right? There's a lot of
Mhm.
people who can talk about what they could theoretically build, uh, but sometimes it's hard to differentiate between people who can actually build things and bring business value. And so from my perspective, now that I'm a hiring manager, if I, was trying to hire someone who also had patents, I would know that, oh, okay, wherever they were at was willing to spend the money, because I will say it's not cheap, uh, to go through the process of getting their work patented because they believed in it enough that they thought that they needed to protect it. And so to me, that's kind of the ultimate indication that you were able to bring business value wherever you were at. And yeah, it's not the only way by any means, right? Like that's not to say that it's, that if you don't have a patent, you're not succeeding. But, it is just one of those things that's like a little bit of a differentiator, I think, on a resume.
It is. It is an impressive sort of component of. If I was looking at a resume and I saw someone, I'd be like, "Yep, we need to get that guy in there." Forget what he's done. Forget the skills. He doesn't know Python. That's fine. That's fine.
It's
Go
fine.
on. It's fine. Um, that's awesome. It's one that I've never heard, and it's never been sort of spoken about in the field as well. And I don't know why people don't talk about it. Maybe there's not a lot of people that have these patents. But definitely there should be more communication around it and providing that as a route for people to explore in terms of visibility within the industry. The second thing I was going to talk about was obviously you said high five the patent attorney. So yeah, he must have done a great job. But one thing I picked up was he had the technical expertise and he also had the legal expertise. So would you say that's sort of like a career field someone within the machine learning industry background could go into? Obviously, legal is a whole bunch of different work, at least 5 more years of education. But is that like a career prospect for machine learning folks to go into?
Oh, 1,000%. Yeah. I think that, if either I've met actually quite a few people who had JD who were thinking of going back to boot camps, like the person I was in a boot camp with. Um, and I think that there are, even when I was in chemistry, I had some attorney friends who were like, you should get a JD and you could do IP law for
Sorry,
chemical
what
companies.
is JD?
Oh, sorry. It's like a doctor of jurisprudence. It's basically the degree you need to be a lawyer. So
Okay.
you get your JD and then you pass your bar exam, and now you're an attorney wherever, like whatever state that is. And I think that's how it goes. Some attorneys probably listening and they're like, that's not exactly true. Sorry. But that's the way that I understand it. So yeah, people who have legal backgrounds who want to study machine learning, I think that's an amazing field to go into if you're into patent law. or IP law. But if you are, yeah, like a machine learning practitioner and you're like, I've always wanted to go to law school. I mean, honestly, just look up some of the salaries for IP attorneys. Like, I think they're some of the highest paid attorneys because their expertise is very niche. Um, and so, if that's kind of your jam, I think it's an amazing career field and something that not a lot of people have the kind of both backgrounds to marry them together and to go into that.
I guarantee you someone's listening to this and in 5 years' time, they're gonna
So
be an
yeah,
IP. Yeah, they're gonna
I
be like,
would
yeah,
love that.
I became an IP attorney because I heard it on a podcast and Carly spoke about it. That is, I think, there's so many sort of like gems coming out of our conversations, so many routes people can explore in terms of their career. It's very interesting. I for sure I've taken away some things, like definitely. You might be seeing a pattern from me soon, inspired by Carly. We can go into the closing conversation, and one thing I like to ask is, where do you see yourself in 5 years from now?
That's a great question. One thing that I have realized through my journey on LinkedIn and through my journey meeting people like yourself is that um, I really love being an advocate for other people. And I love talking about machine learning in an accessible way. And I love helping people realize that, they too can, do whatever it is that their dreams might be telling them to do. So I do see myself staying in gaming. I've really kind of found a niche that I love. And so my goal is to just continue having more visibility within either Activision or, another gaming company as uh, as things change in the industry and as the metaverse is around the corner. And, there's a lot of interesting things coming up for gaming, I think, that is going to kind of revolutionize the way that we think about the internet. And I kind of want to be right there at the forefront of it.
That's exciting. Sounds like it's going to be exciting times for you. Um,
I hope so.
and just closing, who should I speak to next?
Oh, that's such a good question. Um, have you talked to Christina Stathopoulos?
I will be talking to Christina
Oh,
very. We're
I love
organizing a
her.
conversation later.
That's great. She's amazing.
Yes.
I actually have a few non I actually have one woman who I've worked with before who does machine learning for legal applications. So if you want to explore that, I can send you her information. Um, have you talked to Zach
Not
Wilson?
yet. He is on my list
Okay.
to get
Yeah.
to.
He's
Yeah.
great too. I mean, he has a very interesting path to machine learning, I think. And he also has a very interesting take on mental health, taking care of yourself while you're working and, kind of learning from being an overachiever and how not to be too hard on yourself, when you're really kind of like working at your best constantly, and what that can look like. So I love his content and talking to him about that. So yeah, those would be my recommendation.
Excellent. I'll get them on this podcast in a couple months and we'll have a very good
Yeah.
conversation. And I will let them know that Carly, she recommended
Yes.
it. Thanks a lot for this conversation, Carly. There's so many things I came away with, and I'm sure the listeners came away with something as well. We need to do a part two, a round two or part two sometime soon. Maybe, I don't know, in a couple months or in maybe next year, but definitely an exciting conversation. Thank you for your time.
Yeah. Thank you so much. I appreciated this. This was fun.